tonight we'll start with, this is our fourth lesson. This is the Seven Books of History. I have learned a lot just in working on this lesson and getting it ready. I'm not surprised. When I was working through this, Joshua and Judges, Ruth and Samuel and so forth, I was amazed at how much I didn't know. But I'm going to impart something to you tonight. You'll be amazed, and you'll be, wow, all this newfound knowledge. So, tonight specifically we're going to look at the books of history. Now, this is the books from Joshua all the way through Esther. So let's put some of these up here using the black marker. Joshua. Follows Joshua. What follows Joshua?
Judges.
Judges. Very good. Another cherry word. This is easy, isn't it? And follows Judges.
Samuel.
There's one little short one in there.
Ruth.
Book of Ruth. And then the books of Samuel. Books of Kings. Books of Chronicles, all those first and seconds we learned as a kid. And then it's Ezra. And Nehemiah. You're going to say Nehemiah. And last but not least,
That's why I picked it up. Like, Esther.
Esther, all right.
That's how I was going to get out.
Ezekiel. No.
Okay.
But you're right, there's a lot of E words in the Old Testament. Exodus, and Ezra, and Esther, and Ezekiel. I think they had a thing going for the E's. Okay. These are the books of history. These books, various authors, some of them which are named in titles, but a lot of which are not. A lot of the data we have to work with has to do with traditional material. The Babylonian Talmud, which is 4th century AD, is probably the best source of traditional material we have. It's these as far as what the Jews understood to be the authorship, the authors of the various works. There's a time period of about 1,000 years from the time of Joshua through the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So kind of put this in your head. With dealing with the non-functioning black area. About 1400 BC, which is about the time of the conquest of Canaan, to about, I would say give or take, about 450 BC, 400 BC. So about 1,000 years, 150 years worth of history in these 12 books. Now I say 12 because there's first, second, first and second, first and second. Now what you're going to see in your outline tonight, we're going to actually squish some of these together because there's some occasion to do that. We have them listed as 12 separate books in the Old Testament, in our Protestant Old Testament, which is fine. Nope, we're never going to change that. But in terms of authorship and date and composition and why these books are written, we're going to squish some of these books together because they need to be put back into their context, put back into their original state. So let's work it. First off, let's start with the book of Joshua. Take all these guys.
Oh, good to know.
Book of Joshua. Now, in the book of Joshua, what happens as far as content? What's the story of Joshua? Yeah, Joshua is ended the mantle of leadership from Moses. The biggest part of Joshua is the conquest of Canaan, of which Joshua plays a key role. Of course, he's the leader. There's conquest of Canaan. There's also there's division of Canaan. So that's a couple things we're going to look at. The events in the book of Joshua are most likely, I say this, every statement I make tonight about who wrote what, there is a degree of uncertainty that is inherent with this type of thing. Historical documents, you cannot say with 100% certainty Joshua wrote this or someone else wrote that. I can say with 100% certainty that God put all this stuff together. Right. I can say that absolutely. But as far as defining what human hands were involved in that process, that's a different story. But the greatest probability exists for Joshua to be the one that actually put this material together for the book that is made for him. Now, the book is obviously in Joshua because he is the main character. Does that mean he's the author? Well, he is probably the most likely author. He was alive, and he is recorded as being alive throughout most of the book to witness the events that are in there. And it would have been, what would you say would have been the purpose of recording all these things in the book of Joshua? Talking about the conquest, talking about the dividing up of the land, and getting everybody moving to the proper place. What do you think would be the purpose of writing all that down? Okay. Case in point. Over the weekend, we were at my mother-in-law's, and they had a plat book of Park County. And in that book, there was a page after page after page of who owned what piece of land. Now, Joshua serves as kind of a plat book for the people of Israel, especially after Canaan. Because if you recall the law was that the land never left your family. You always had, as a family, you were guaranteed a certain piece of land. Now, your division of that land may have got smaller and smaller over time, but you were guaranteed that piece of land. Having all of this in writing, as far as how that land was divided, would help. You say you're the great grandson of Jehoshaphat or of Judah or whoever it was. You could look back in that book. Okay, his land was from this landmark to this landmark to this landmark, and so on. So having all that written down would have been a big help. But there's a larger purpose even in this, that this here was the promise to Abraham, to Moses, to the Israelites that they were going to be moving into the land of milk and honey. And Joshua is the necessary record of that. You cannot just stop at Deuteronomy. Matter of fact, remember how Deuteronomy ends. Here's the River Jordan. And here's Jericho over here, and these are the plains. I think these are plains of Shittim on this side, and on the entire Israel's camped on this side. And that's the end of Deuteronomy. Having had to be a promise, crossing, having been promised all the land over here, you can't just stop. So, the story goes on. Joshua provides the necessary bridge between the time of the Exodus, time of Deuteronomy, to the time of Judges. How did we get here from here? Get this point from where we were? Hence Joshua. So, likely written by Joshua, with a short appendix at the end marking Joshua's death, as probably by another hand, probably somebody else just took whatever he'd written and made a short note at the end. Joshua died, was buried with his fathers, and so on and so forth. Four main divisions of this book. First is conquering Canaan. That's chapters 1 through 12. Second is dividing Canaan. That's chapters 13 through 22. Third is Joshua's address. This is Joshua's exhortation to the people of Israel to be faithful to the law and to abide by what God commanded. And fourthly, the burial of Canaan. You have Joshua's burial. I think there's a son of one of the priests is buried. Eliezer, one of Aaron's sons, and Joseph. Joseph is buried. And if you remember, Joseph's burial was asked for way back in Genesis. Don't bury me in this land, but bury me at home. Bury me in Canaan. So you have these three burials here at the end of the book of Joshua. One thing that doesn't happen in Joshua, which sets up the situation in Judges. If you recall, every book of the Bible up to this point, there has been a definitive leader. There was Adam and Seth and Noah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. There's always been this leader. And then Joseph, of course, handed off, it was Moses. And then Moses hands it off to Joshua. But at the end of Joshua, there's not this phrase that says, and Joshua appointed so-and-so to be the leader. So into the next book of Judges, there is this vast gap, this vacuum of power. Who is going to lead Israel? How do they know? What are they going to do? Well, that takes us to our next section. And the next section is really, I know it's Judges, but I want to put Judges and Ruth together. I'll tell you why. Now, Judges and Ruth both cover the same time period. That is the period between the time of Joshua and the time of the first king, King Saul. Judges and Ruth both reflect a similar lack of worship and of zeal, of love for God in this time. I mean, it's sad. Now, Judges is worse than Ruth. Ruth is kind of the high point here. But Judges is just appalling. You want to bum yourself out. You can either read Job, you can read Ecclesiastes, or you can read Judges. I mean, this is the bottom of the barrel type stuff here. And in Judges, what's that?
Jeremiah.
Jeremiah's, at least he's calling out to God. These guys are just very nasty. But there's something different about Judges and Ruth that really sets them apart together, and that's the author. Now, the time period is again at that time between Joshua and Samuel. But the authorship of these two works, there's been several options that have been laid out. I'm going to give you the one that I like the most. Again, this is just in caution, not definite, not 100%. This is what I like. That's Samuel as the author of both these works. Now, I like Samuel because there's a phrase in Judges that repeats over and over and over. Get your Bible. Turn with me to Judges 17, verse 6. If you got it, let me read it.
In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes.
In those days, there was no king. Now, there's a subtext to that. What's going on in these days? In my day, as I'm writing this down, you think there'd be a king? Whoever is writing this, do you think there'd be a king in his day as there wasn't in those days? I mean, it's not obvious, but it's possible.
Past tense.
It's kind of a past tense. It's kind of like, that's in the old day. That's long before we had the internet, or long before we had the air conditioning, something like that.
So it was written after the time of the history.
Yeah, it kind of gives that impression. But you move on to chapter 18, verse 1, and chapter 19, verse 1, and chapter 21, verse 25. It's the same
So the whole thing was
phrase. The whole thing is written toward a specific purpose at a later time. And this is what these phrases point toward. Now, does that mean the entirety of the book was composed at that later time? Absolutely not. Because what you find most often in Scripture is that these things will be written down somewhere. And somebody will leave them. And they'll walk away from them. Somebody else will come along and they'll pick it up. And they'll say, hey, I didn't know that happened. Well, I'll just incorporate it in what I'm writing. Well, that kind of describes this whole process in this Old Testament period. There are those that take records, and there are those that take those records and kind of edit them into a longer work. What I think happened here is this. Samuel, in the time of Saul and of David, Samuel was not one that liked kings. You remember his attitude in the book of Samuel? He didn't like what was going on. He thought Israel was sinning by having a king, but God said, anoint Saul, anoint David, and so he does. He is also the one who is working at Shiloh, whether he's the priest or the head function or whatever. So he has access to whatever documents, whatever records have been made up to that time. I think Samuel, maybe more than anybody else, would be a good name to attach to these books. Because here is somebody, the purpose of Judges is this, to demonstrate to people of Israel, hey, having a king may not have been that bad of an idea after all. Because you remember what happened back when we didn't have a king. Remember when there was no king in Israel? There was no leader in Israel? Remember what happened back then? And here's story after story of Israel, this repetitive cycle of Israel falling away and becoming oppressed, and the judge being called up to deliver them. And they're delivered, and they repent, and everything's hunky-dory for a while, and then they start falling away again. This cycle happens over and over and over again. And the reason, apparently, is, in those days they had no king, and everyone did as he saw fit. Now, this phrase doesn't occur up in the last part of the book. Matter of fact, this last section, I call this is from chapter 17 to the end of the book. That last section may have only been the newest material, which is why this phrase keeps repeating. Whereas the other parts were just pulled from whatever records were together. But I think Samuel brings all these things together, and especially after a considerable time, after Joshua.
It's more than just no king. They had no God. That's why it's interesting.
Yeah. The lack of a king goes far deeper than simply having a leader in power. There is a complete disregard. I mean, the fact that they have no king includes they don't even recognize God as king. And that was what Samuel's lament was in the opening part of Samuel. Samuel cries out to God, these people don't even recognize you. That, God, you should be the king, but they don't even recognize you. So this is kind of a subtle way to say, when the people don't recognize the king, they're going to do everything they want to. So the whole book of Judges becomes this apology on why we need to have godly leadership in place. Divide this book in 4 sections. The first section is recalling Joshua. This is Judges 1 to 3:6. I found this a fascinating read. If you read those first 3 chapters of Judges, you'll notice they parallel Joshua. Matter of fact, Joshua is resurrected for those first 3 chapters. He dies again. And he is remembered as the last great leader of Israel. There's some stories in the first 3 chapters that are repeated from Joshua. And that kind of lends me to think that Judges, when this was finally completed, was a considerable time after the book of Joshua, as a sense of reminding everybody. You remember back in the days? Remember back when Joshua was around? And here's some of the stories from the book of Joshua. So there's like this gap between. I know it's not evident in our Bibles because everything's all put together. But in the history, here's Joshua, and then the period of Judges, which may have been upwards of 200 years. Conservatively 150 to 200 years. And then you have Judges. Now here's this fresh work of the Judges, and here's that covers the whole time. And the opening chapter says, hey, you remember back when? You remember when Joshua was around? Remember how good things were back then? And then see how fast things have fallen apart. Second section there is delivering Israel. Chapter 3, verses 7 to 16 is basically a summary of the rest of the book. It describes that cycle. Israel sinned, God sent oppressors, they repented, he sent the judge liberated them. Chapters 3 chapter 3, verse 7, all the way to chapter 16, is then the recording of the histories. Notable people in there: Gideon, Samson, Shamgar, my personal favorite, Ehud, Jephthah. Just a lot of names for everybody. Deborah and Barak in there. Third section then, it's exercising apostasy. That's chapter 17 to 21. Now 17 to 21 are different from the rest of the book, because in those 4 or 5 chapters there are no judges. Now it's just stories illustrating how bad Israel is. This is a story of Micah the Levite that is called up to be a priest in the house of Micah. Now I get the names confused. But this Levite's called to be a priest, and then the Danites come, and then we're going to go up to Laish and destroy Laish. You be our priest, and you be minister to our God, because they take this false god, make it their god, and they go up and they march into Laish, which is a completely peaceful city. They have, nobody's there raising Cain or anything, and they just go and they slaughter everybody. Now we own the city. Now we own the city. The story of the Levite, where the same Levite, it's probably not, but he and his concubine go to stay overnight. Very similar to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. He stays overnight. The men come knocking on the door. We want to see your visitor. We want to know him. And they ends up shoving the woman out. And then she suffers. And he gets up in the morning, of course, sends part of her to all 12 tribes. I mean, it's just the illustration of how bad the Israelites are. So this last part of the book, the character is a little bit different. It's a bit darker. Until you finally get to the last verse of Judges, which becomes the symbol, the one verse that represents the whole book. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as he saw fit. It's just a sad, sad book. I might add this. Something that Judges does prove, and it should be enlightening for us Christians. Who was the leader during the period of Judges? They had the tabernacle, and they had the priesthood. And I would hope that somewhere in there was the law. L-A-W. And that this I think Judges is a great experiment. What can a people do if they have no leader, but they have the Word of God? What will happen? And Judges illustrates what will happen. And I was thinking of this passage in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 56. The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is in law. Remember how Paul had that struggle? What I want to do, I don't do. What I don't want to do, I do. Until I had read the law, I didn't know what sin was. But then I read the law, and then I wanted to. He gives the illustration of wanting to covet, and I didn't have that temptation before I read the law, but here's the law, and I read it, and now I want to do it. It is probably not, or the law was probably not very well communicated during this time. But it is a remarkable illustration of a time when there was no leadership, overarching leadership. Every one of those judges was local, regional. They weren't leaders of the whole place. But what will the people do when they just have the book? How will they respond to that? How can they be, and we call this today a theocracy, where it is ruled by God? How will people act when God is set up as the king, and there is no one else in that position? And Judges, sadly, is a commentary on human nature. If they didn't see, and they, of course, all this was voluntary. You had, you were told to go to the tabernacle, you were told to offer sacrifices, but if you didn't, you see what happens.
How can you call it theocracy?
Because with theocracy, God as the ruler.
So how's God rule if there's no leader?
Exactly.
So exactly, it's not a theocracy.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. When you have a person in leadership, like a king or a president or something like that, you have a visible head of state. But when you call it a theocracy, you are governing by the law or by the God that the state worships. And this is an extreme case, I'll grant you, because even in modern theocracies,
You're assuming a lot there, I don't think.
maybe, but in modern theocracies like Iran, for example, Iran is probably the only theocracy that exists today. But they have heads of state. They have people that represent them. But they call themselves a theocracy because they're governed by the law. They're governed by the book. Whereas this is a pure situation where there wasn't a ruler per se. It was just the priesthood, it was the tabernacle, and you had your periodic judges that delivered people, but there was no one person that says, follow me as I follow Christ.
By law, they don't have any priest or judge or leader.
Right.
So they're not,
Right.
it's not convicted by the law.
In theory, that's what it was, but in practice, it failed.
Isn't that pretty much the failure of our families today? When the father figure does not stand up and take the leadership role of, this is the law, and I am who you answer to about it. Hasn't society at this point tried to take away all the authority of both parents, but in particular the father, by making him look like a buffoon on TV continually?
Yep. Good point.
And what we have is the children do right in their own eyes.
Mhm.
And it is working just about this well.
Yep. That's even that comment is made in Judges. It's very similar to the comment in the first part of Exodus where it says there arose a Pharaoh that knew not Joseph. In Judges, there arose the generation that followed the elders and the Joshua, and sadly the instruction of Deuteronomy 6 was never carried out, where you pass on the law from father to children, and it gets disseminated from generation to generation. It's simply not done. And Judges, sadly, this is the low point of Israel. I mean, they are the bottom of the well, the bottom of the gutter. Which is why, this is what's so fascinating about Ruth. Judges, if you read Judges and Ruth together, Ruth is like that lift at the end of the book, or it's like, as our Bible says, the next book. But Ruth is traditionally ascribed to Samuel as well. Now, both books about the same time. I'll give you this little theory. Take the theory or not. There is a small section at the end of Ruth that lends itself to this idea of Samuel's authorship. This is the section of the genealogy. Back to chapter 4, verse 18. You get this small little section about Perez and Hezron, and Hezron father of Ram, and Ram's father of Abinadab. And you fast forward and you get to Obed and Jesse, and you get the father of David. Now, if Ruth, if we're talking about the same authorship, here is, we've got this awful book on the one side, but we've got this beautiful short story on the other. I personally see Samuel as writing both of these, but the story of Ruth, I think, comes from a different source. Let's talk about Ruth just for a minute, with Samuel. Ruth is what nationality? I know. She is a Moabite Tess, and you should know that. Moabites. Remember where Moabites came from? Moab, who came from
Ishmael.
Lot.
They come from Ishmael.
One of the Lot's daughters.
Yeah. One of Lot's kids, she's descended from. And of course, the Moabites were those are the characters that deceived the Israelites in the desert, sent out their daughters to deceive the sons, and caused Israel to sin on a massive scale. This is advice of Balaam, your Balak. The story of Ruth really starts like, oh, this is another judge's story. Elkanah, or not Elkanah, man and his wife, what's his name? Elimelech, there it is, Elimelech. Isn't that Edom? Another Edom. Elimelech and Naomi moved to Moab. Like, oh man, Moab, that's like the dirt section of Palestine. Why did anyone want to move to Moab? His two sons, Bala and Chilion, married Moabite women. Oh man, this is like that whole Moabite story all over again. And without really any surprise, Elimelech, Bala and Chilion, all three died. So that's just Naomi and Oprah and Ruth. And there's a separation, of course. This is actually section 4. I call this preserving the Messiah. I'll tell you why. Following that last chapter 3 of exercising apostasy, now we're preserving the Messiah, because this story tells how God preserved His promise through this awful, wicked time. Now we know the story of Ruth. Ruth moves back home with Naomi, and she meets Boaz, and then there's this whole process, this legal stuff that they have to go through for Boaz to marry Ruth. But at the very end of the book of Ruth, we find out why we have been led through this story. Because Boaz is the father of Obed, and Obed is the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of David. Now here's how I imagine this happened. 1 Samuel 16. Samuel is called by God to go to the house of Jesse in Bethlehem, right? He says, in the house of Jesse is going to be the man who's going to be the next king. And it's like, Samuel's like, oh, man. Because very open in the chapter, he's mourning and he's grieving because Saul is really messed up. He has not been the kind of king, because he really had his hopes on Saul. Saul was going to whip everybody back into shape. Saul was going to restore God as the king, and Saul has just fallen down a hole. And Samuel is just, he's heartbroken and he's shaken and he's depressed. God said, I'm going to send you to the household of Jesse. Samuel goes to the household of Jesse, and he goes through all of his sons. And God says, no, not this one, not this one, not this one. This is the last son. And says, there's the one. So he appoints David, and he is one king. Now the text says, then Samuel left. But I think this is what I think happens. Big celebration. Jesse's son, David, is going to be the next king. Now, we're not advertising this because Saul is still in Gibeon. He's still in charge. But there's this kind of this quiet celebration, and around that campfire, or that fire, as they're roasting the lamb or whatever, Jesse calls Samuel, hey, I want to tell you a story, and tells him this story. And Samuel realizes why David is the one. Because David comes from the line of Judah. Judah had the promise of the scepter shall never leave Judah, and the whole promise of the Messiah was through this line. And I see Samuel's thinking, the new lease on life now. Because David is going to be the next king. Now it's funny, in that Ruth 4:22, David is not mentioned as king. It doesn't say the father of David the king, it says the father of David. So which leads some to believe, and I'm putting this up on the screen, that at the time this was written, David was not yet king. It was discovered that he was important, but he was not yet king. So he simply listed as listed by name. Whether it actually happened or not, I don't know. I just kind of a fancy, kind of an interesting little story. If it happened, great. But this is, I see Samuel as really putting both these together. Judges is kind of the long trek downhill, but Ruth is kind of up that lift there at the end. Like, things are not as bad as it could be. Ruth's testimony, here's a foreigner who embraces God as Israel has just let loose of him. This foreign woman becoming the mother, just like Rahab was with that woman, the future Messiah. And we see that reflected in Matthew 1. So that's Judges and Ruth. Next section. The next 4 books belong together. What are the next 4 books? All right, memorize your Old Testament from long ago. These are the books of Samuel and the books of Kings. Now, these 4 books were originally 2. Samuel was 1 book and Kings was 1 book. They were divided in the Greek translation because there wasn't enough people. Very practical consideration. What happened was, this is the fundamental difference between Hebrew and Greek. Hebrew is kind of looks like that. The Greek, very soft, very flowing, kind of like that. Hebrew goes that way, Greek goes this way. The Greek adds one crucial element to language that Hebrew did not have. You know what that is? Vowels. In Greek, you have vowels. In Hebrew, you do not. So that automatically expands the amount of paper or the amount of material you're going to need to write down it. Effectively doubling the size of these books. So when they began to translate these things in Greek, we call that the Septuagint, by the way, represented by LXX. Samuel became 1st and 2nd Samuel. Kings became 1st and 2nd Kings. As a matter of fact, they even changed the name of the books. LXX is 70. Yeah. They changed the names of the books to 1st 70. That's just the abbreviation. It goes back to the legend of how it was made. That's back in our introduction section. In the Greek translation, Samuel and Kings became 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th kingdoms. So that if you pick up a Septuagint, you'll see 1st kingdom, 2nd kingdom, 3rd kingdom, 4th kingdom, because it describes the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Okay, now back to 70. The legend of the Septuagint is that 70 translators translated the entire Old Testament separately in 70 days. And all 70 copies matched up precisely. Again, that's the legend. Greek ones.
So why do we have it in Greek instead of Hebrew Septuagint?
Well, the Septuagint, the reason we use Septuagint today is because sometimes the Septuagint may represent an older Hebrew text than the text of Hebrew that we currently have. Up till 60 years ago, the oldest Hebrew text that scholars had to play with was 10th century. Matter of fact, the oldest complete Hebrew text is it's called the Leningrad Codex. All in Hebrew. It's a Masoretic text, but it's not older than 1,000 years. Well, we're talking about events that happened between 1400 and 400 BC. You're adding another 1,500 years, or not even 1,000, 2,000. Yeah, another 2,000 years to the events that actually happened, to the actual record that we have of those events. Now, when I say 60 years ago, you had the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which dated back to the 2nd century BC, which was a whole lot closer to the events that actually happened than what we had before. But again, this Septuagint, sometimes there's translations that come out of the Septuagint, which some say are better, or rather more faithful to what was actually written than what we have now that is recorded in Hebrew. It's a whole critical mess, really. And there are rules that govern which is better and which is worse. I can tell you this, of all the variations that exist between the Septuagint, between the Dead Sea Scrolls, and between the Masoretic text that we have today, 95% agree 100%. It's that 5% that gets squirrely. and people get all bent out of shape over it, as to, this is translated over this. NIV does a decent job of telling you, okay, some of these things, in the
So there's no original, even though the Jewish faith has not been disrupted throughout since its inception, they don't have a constant written record of their religion and history.
Sweetheart, they're trying to remove in God we trust from our money, and that's how old.
Well, I'm just finding that interesting because it takes such painstaking care to make sure everything's reproduced precisely so, and that they have a 1,000-year gap, and only the Jews can be trusted to protect their history.
It sounds crazy. It does.
But there are real people involved. I mean, God has His plan, and as far as we can tell, it's in here. And it changes your life by you being in here. But when it gets down to the minute details, who cares?
That's why this document discovery was so important. Because the process that you're talking about, the careful transmission from one generation to the next, really didn't come about until after the destruction of Jerusalem in the first century AD. It was then people realized we need to take particular care of our likeness. This is all we've got left. That's why the Masoretic text of the 10th century agrees, again, 99% with the Dead Sea Scrolls, because they're after this is 185 BC, and this process started in the first century AD. You have about 200 years. It was amazing when they discovered these things that they agreed 99% with what they had from 1,000 years later, because they realized somebody somewhere at that point, they began to be very careful. But it's just like New Testament documents. Nobody has an original Moses Deuteronomy or an original Joshua, Book of Joshua. It's just not there. Those things have been lost to time. But we do have enough that we can go back and we can say this is, 99%, this is what was written, just like we do with the New Testament. But that's the field of biblical criticism. And that's a whole other art. Let's get back to this. Samuel and Kings. Briefly, the outline. I've got six parts of this outline. The first part of Samuel is the first 7 chapters of Samuel. This is the story of Samuel. Hannah and her husband Elkanah. She goes to Eli, and he says, "Oh, you must be drunk because you're talking to yourself." I do that all the time. Nobody's ever accused me of being drunk, but okay. She prays for a son. She gets a son. She leaves him, and he's weaned in the tabernacle. And she has many more children. That's how Samuel gets started. First 7 chapters. The next 7, 1 Samuel 8 through 15, is the story of Saul, the first kingdom of Israel. Third section, this is 1 Samuel 16, all the way through 2 Samuel to 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 37. The story of David. Huge. Spans 3 whole books, this guy. This is a story. There's really, in some quote-unquote circles, David, there's so much written about him. Some people say, well, he couldn't really have existed because he's like a legendary. He's like Paul Bunyan. He couldn't really exist. Nobody could do all he did. Let me show you something. Not long ago, this was discovered. This is called the Tel Dan inscription, because it was found in the old ancient territory of Dan. This is a inscription by Hazael of Aram, and on this inscription, now he doesn't write about fighting Saul and David, like that. He writes about fighting Jehoram, who was a descendant of David. But this is the oldest and best extra biblical reference to David because he refers to Jehoram as being of the house of David. This is a phenomenal importance. This proves that David really existed. Now, if you didn't believe the Bible, this proves that David actually existed. Before that, there was a mysterious inscription on this thing. This is called the Moabite stone. Again, another foreign power. But he mentions David, but it's been argued, oh, it's not really David, it could be something else. So that's a couple of inscriptions that demonstrate, we're not just speaking jive here, this stuff actually happened. And there are people from other cultures, and sadly, I hate to say this, sadly, some scholars, a lot of scholars really, put more weight on this stuff than they do on the Bible.
Right.
Sadly. It shouldn't be that way.
Well, scholars are looking at it for the wrong reason. They're not looking at the spiritual enlightenment because their knowledge rests in the knowledge of man, not of God.
What they can prove, what they can see.
Right? What they can debate, what they can twist.
Exactly. Even with this Tel Dan description, there are even some that, well, that's not really David. That's like it's a god named Joel or something. See, he was talking about something else. I'm sorry. Now you're reaching. It's right there. It's right there. Anyway, story of David, 1 Samuel 16, all the way through 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 37. Then, of course, it follows with the story of Solomon, 1 Kings 1:38 to verse chapter 11. And this is the end of the single united kingdom. Because for section 5, the divided kingdom, 1 Kings 12, 2 Kings 17, story after story after story. This king was good, this king was bad. It's interesting. The good kings are always compared to David, as far as how well they did compared to David. The Israelite kings are always compared to how bad they did compared to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Well, he may have been bad, but he wasn't near as bad as Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Whereas David, all the kings of David's line, the kings of Judah, well, he was good, but he still, he was like a 7 compared to David's 10, or he did worse than David did. So there's this kind of a subtle phrasing there, letting you know which one's involved. Last section there's the kings of Judah to the exile. That's 2 Kings 18 and 25. And that really draws Kings to a close. As far as who wrote these things, there are several possibilities, and I would say that there's probably validation all of them. Samuel, obviously. Who better to tell Samuel's story than Samuel? But there's some other ones here. Look over at 1 Chronicles 29, verse 29. The Bible gives us a couple other possibilities. Actually adds a couple more. You got that, girl? Go ahead and read that, girl.
Now the acts of King David, from first to last, are written in the Chronicles of Samuel the seer, in the Chronicles of Nathan the prophet, and in the Chronicles of Gad the seer.
Samuel, Nathan, and Gad. All three of them described in that first king throughout the story of David as prophets in his court. Who was the prophet that called Samuel on the whole Bathsheba incident? Nathan. Yeah. These were men who were familiar with David. Could go into his court. I mean, in that particular incident, Nathan had to dance around a little bit. He couldn't just say, "Hey, David, I heard you slept with Uriah's wife." He had to be very careful because his neck was on the line. But he could confidently say, "You are the man," when David called his own judgment into question. So these guys are, as the Bible says, these are the ones that actually record the story of the kings, first story of Samuel. Samuel, obviously, Nathan and Gad. Now, someone probably came back and put these stories together in one book. But you can see the process. Samuel would write it until he died, and then Nathan would pick up the story until he died. Gad would do the same thing. until you get to the books of the Kings, which traditionally have been ascribed to Jeremiah. It's kind of fascinating. We know Jeremiah mostly for his role in the kingship of Josiah as the weeping prophet, as the prophet that saw the exile and carting off to Babylon. Never really thought of Jeremiah as an author or as a writer more than the book that bears his name. But tradition, the more I think about it, as tradition has put these in Jeremiah's lap, but maybe there's some sense to that. Jeremiah may have been the one to take these records and put them into sort of at least to keep them, and then to pick up the story with the first Kings and second Kings. Again, conjecture, possibility. There's a couple other books that you need to be aware of. 1 Kings 14:29 speaks of the book of the Annals of the King of Judah. 1 Kings 14:19, there's reference to the Annals of the Kings of Israel, the book of the Annals of the Kings of Israel. So you have the writings of these prophets, put Jeremiah up there, plus the books, the court records of the individual kings, as records that someone much later could go back and begin to put two and two together and come up with have a continuous story. The books must have been the books together from the time of 1 Samuel to the end of 2 Kings, 500-year span. There's a long period of time that it's covering. So it makes sense. I would prefer Jeremiah to somebody else. I need to make you aware there is a theory out there. Spell it without making my need to be. There we go. The Deuteronomist theory. Spelled D. Deuteronomist theory is the alternative theory to what I've just described to you. Deuteronomist theory says that sometime 450 BC, 400 BC, somebody, after the return of the exiles, decided to record and get all this information together and to basically write the Bible. And he says the theory goes, the process started with the book of Deuteronomy and goes all the way through the end of Nehemiah. And he said you can tell there's different strains, you can see the different stories. Like there's one story. Just case in point, how was David introduced to King Saul? Anybody know?
Was that when Lisa?
Okay, that's one. That's one. There's the harp story where Saul needs Valium something and a depressant, and David is called up. So there's this guy that plays the harp really well, and he calls a savage soul, savage beast. So they call David in, and David begins to play, and the song goes, I feel so much better now. It's beautiful. But there's another story in there.
What's the
Yeah, the story of Goliath.
Goliath where he gets David's funny clothes?
Yeah. And between the two stories, now they occur one right after the other. But in both stories, it's as if David and Saul had never met. It's like, wow. I don't know. Well, why don't you come fight my battle?
Is Saul trying to kill David later on?
Yeah, and later on, Saul trying to kill David. But here's these two different stories of how they meet. And this, Deuteronomy says, is proof that there's two sets of stories that are being shared. And this is proof that God didn't write the thing. Man just put his stories together, and there you have it.
Either that, or it's kind of like, I once saw you at a party, but I didn't know who you were, and then I went to another party, and there you were again.
Yeah.
You know?
I think you can have a little ox and a pole.
Yeah.
Is this proof positive? Well, this is just, you could go back and you can work on those stories and you can find, there's just not enough of that to say proof positive that's what's going on. That may say something about, yeah, there's the story from here, there's a story from here. But again, God is the one who put all these things together, and God knows how this stuff works. If you're honest, again, this is a theory that's out there. If you ever watch, God help you, if you ever watch this stuff on TV that purports to be from Scripture, and they start talking about Old Testament, this is what they're going to use. They're going to say that somebody put these stories together without any spiritual guidance. I am telling you that under the guidance of prophets, and probably even court records is a reference in Scripture, God wove all these things together, whether by the hand of Jeremiah or by the hand of one of these guys. All these things do form a cohesive whole.
But there again, it all comes to focusing on the minor, when the major is, if you focus on the book, it will change you.
True. True. The books themselves cover the whole history of Israel's monarchy, from start to finish. And as such, are they any better? Was Israel really any better off with kings than it was with judges? No? Okay. They still went downhill. They had some highlights. Now, they had some high points.
Every once in a while they pull out a king that says, let's dust off the book again and look at it.
Yeah.
But overall, no.
Two major exceptions in the whole string of kings: Hezekiah and Josiah. I find it fascinating that both of these righteous kings have incredibly prolific prophets associated with them. You have your Elijah and your Ahab. You have your Elisha and your Jehu, but those pale in comparison to Isaiah and Hezekiah and Jeremiah and Josiah. I mean, there's these massive prophetic tones that are composed, that are delivered, that are put together during the times of righteous kings. And that says to me, God knew that people were listening. So he just downloaded massive amounts of information. In Isaiah you have the promise of the Messiah. In Jeremiah you have the promise of destruction, but also of deliverance. So people are listening. God really gets people talking.
Well, or it can also be that God tries to talk, but we only listen sometimes. And sometimes he is able to use people.
Yeah.
Because they stop and listen.
Yeah.
It also tells me that the king is not as good without a good prophet, and a prophet is not as good without a good king.
Mm-hmm. I think the two. There's no accident here. It didn't accidentally happen that way. I think there's a connection here between the relative righteousness of the king and God's willingness to use them. Okay, this takes us really to our last big section, because in the books of Old Testament history, there's three main sections. First two we've already been through, and I classify these by authorship, really. You've got Joshua, way out here in front, 1400 BC. You've got Judges, and really just a steady stream of material from Judges all the way to 2 Kings, covering that period of roughly, let's call it 600-700 years. Just this constant stream, from the hand of Samuel, theoretically, all the way through the hand of Nathan, Gad, Jeremiah, and so forth, to the end of Kings. Our third major section is, now in our Bibles, it is the book of Chronicles that starts off. In the Hebrew Bible, the book of Chronicles sometimes is the last of the section. It follows Ezra and Nehemiah. But we'll stick with what we've got here. Books of Chronicles. Now, first of all, what's in the books of Chronicles? Yeah, it is the record. The book of Chronicles starts from the very beginning. If you look at 1 Chronicles 1:1, what's the first word?
Adam.
The outline for this section, number 1, is genealogy from Genesis. It's 1 Chronicles 1 through 9. We start all the way from Adam, and really, by the end of Chronicles, we are at the promise or the return of the exile. Now, as a scholar, I must say that if you have this information dated, and you assume Chronicles was all one book, then the author of Chronicles had to have been there or to live after this point here, after the end point. You can't say he was alive halfway through and then died. If you assume it was just one author, that is. If you say that this was composed from a number of different authors, you're taking a different tack. But as a whole, as a completed work, Chronicles has to be dated sometime after the return of the exile, which is fine. Really, it's fine. We don't have to push for, getting it back there, the time of the kings or anything, because we already have that information. We already have 1st and 2nd Samuel. We already have 1st and 2nd Kings. We already have a whole list of what happened during that time. Chronicles has a different point. Whereas Samuel and Kings demonstrated for us, hey, the kings were a good idea, but even they strayed. And God still sent his judgment. Chronicles is a little different point, a little different purpose. It covers much of the same material. That is, it goes from Adam through the history of Israel, through the kings. Amazing, interesting fact to point though, Chronicles does not chronicle the history of the kings of Israel. Only the kings of Judah. It's not concerned with what happened with Ahab and Jezebel and all that stuff before. It just talks about what happens in Judah. And occasionally they'll talk about something to the north of just how it affects what happened in Judah. Goes all the way through the exile to, again, the return. The promised return. We go back to the 2nd Chronicles, the very end of 2nd Chronicles. See what I'm talking about. There is the promise. 2nd Chronicles 36:23. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. Appointed me to build the temple for him at Jerusalem and Judea. Here's the promise. We're going to go back. We're going to go back and build the temple. The Jews are going to be released from captivity.
Would this be Nehemiah then?
We're getting there. Talking about authorship? Yeah. In Chronicles, talking about authorship of Chronicles as far as the human hand involved, there are just a few candidates. One is Ezra, because when Ezra went back and reestablished Judaism, reestablished temple worship, you remember that story where he read the book of the law to people? He had access to the library.
He found the library.
Yeah. So it makes a lot of sense if he had access to the library, and he could go back and look things up. He had access to 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, the book of Genesis, the whole thing. He is a very satisfying author as far as human hands are concerned. Very satisfying because it's plausible. He could have gone back, he could have done that. The purpose of Chronicles, it is a reminder to the Jews who have returned from exile in Babylon that God keeps his promises. This isn't kind of a warning, as you better shape up or God's going to send you off to exile. That was, that's what Samuel King said. This kind of moment by moment. Oh, they failed again. We got to bring it back. Oh, they failed again. We got to bring it back. This was more like, even though they failed, God still keeps his promises. even though they messed up, God still chose David. He chose Solomon. He chose the temple. I mean, this litany of things that God, the Jews are still God's chosen people because they will build the temple again. So Ezra was very satisfying because that's what Ezra was trying to do. He was trying to encourage the Jews. Purify yourselves, put away your former lives, get back on track here with God and with the law. And what better way to do that than to tell them the story of how we got here? Which, incidentally, if Ezra is the one that put Chronicles together, Chronicles does make more sense after Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, the Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah are all written in similar styles. That is, they're all post-exilic. That is, they contain some Babylonian borrowed words. They have kind of similar language between the three of them, between the four of them, rather. But if we posit Ezra as the human hand here, that makes more sense after Chronicles, where he has had a chance to go back and to get the study and to write things down and so forth. Genealogy from Genesis, section 1. Section 2 is the United Kingdom. This is chapter 10 through 2 Chronicles 9. Section 3, Kingdom of Judah. That's chapter 10 to 36:8. And then the exile and return, the 36:9 to 23. This is the last section of 2 Chronicles. Chronicles do give us valuable information that parallels what happened in Samuel Kings. Because Chronicles has information that wasn't in Samuel Kings. Remember back in the reign of David, what was David's biggest sin? Yeah, in 2 Samuel, that David's sin is killing Uriah, marrying his wife, and having a child. You know what David's biggest sin in Chronicles is? Doesn't even mention Bathsheba in Chronicles.
No. I knew it wasn't the same, but I can't remember.
He gets in trouble for making the list,
That's right. Soldiers.
making the census. And that in Chronicles, now we haven't heard anything about that from Samuel Kings, but in Chronicles, here's a story. Oh my goodness, he was really messed up twice. Didn't know that before. So there's different stories. Not that they're disharmonious, because you can very easily harmonize too, but just additional material that wasn't in Samuel Kings that probably came from the books of the annals, probably came from different sources that Ezra just found in the library. It's a good story. But all with the idea, you're going to encourage God's people with this stuff. This is encouraging stuff. And of course, God is the one that's driving it in all this. So Chronicles are really a great conclusion to the history books. But in our Bible, that's not the case. They're not the conclusion. What is the conclusion? Well, it's Esther, so we have it up there. The next two books, Ezra and Nehemiah, form in the Hebrew Bible one book. Both books were composed about the same time. They have always been together. This places them probably 450 BC. That's when they're written. Like I said before, they follow the style of the Chronicles, which, again, points to that idea that the Chronicles author and the author of this, writer of this, are either the same person or the same school. They went to the same college. These books describe the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel, to see them back to the land. These books fulfill much the same function that Joshua did. Whereas Joshua was the book of fulfillment for the law, the book of fulfillment of the promises, the land, milk, and honey, and so on and so forth. Ezra and Nehemiah are the fulfillment of God's promises to his people, that he would restore them to the land. promised that he'd give it through Jeremiah, promises that he'd give it through Isaiah. Both of these guys have different functions. And this will be evident from the outline. First of all, section 1, rebuilding the temple. This is Ezra 1 through 6. First half of Ezra is concerned about going back, getting the temple rebuilt. There's some legalese that goes on in there, some letters that pass back and forth between Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, Cyrus, that really, why are we doing this? Because there was such opposition in Israel, in Jerusalem, to rebuilding that temple. The governors that surrounded them, the governors of Samaria primarily, were opposed to seeing the Jews restored to their homeland because they presented an opposing force. I mean, the people in Samaria, for example, they have their own gods. They really didn't need Jerusalem reestablished. So when Ezra comes in, this is section 2, Ezra, chapter 7 to 10. Ezra's goal is to get this project on track and to get that temple rebuilt. In Nehemiah, you have enter Nehemiah, section 3. This is chapters 1 through 7 of Nehemiah. Whereas Ezra was concerned with the temple, Nehemiah is concerned with the city. Let's get the city rebuilt. Let's get the walls put back up. Nehemiah was more of an administrator. He was more of a governor type, whereas Ezra was more of a scribe, more of a priest type person. But both of them essential to getting Jerusalem and ultimately Judea back on track, which is the last section, covenant renewed, chapters 8 through 13. In this section, this is the section where the wives are commanded to put away foreign wives. The covenant is reestablished. The Sabbath is reestablished, and really sets up the tone for what's going to happen in the New Testament. It is from Ezra and from the school of scribes that he founds that you have the scribes of the New Testament. You have the Pharisees of the New Testament that are zealous for the law. Ezra is responsible for the New Testament zeal that we see in the Pharisees and the scribes.
Well, I firsthand experienced what's screwing that up in Luke for you, so we're going to go the other way.
Right. Matter of fact, that's what's so fascinating, is that up to this point, they had gone so far the other way, it was deplorable. But what they do now is go the complete opposite direction. They become super observant rather than non-observant. They become legalists as opposed to libertarians.
Well, is that not any different than the Puritans of the New World? Were not they the zealots of returning to, God's... Isn't that what the Puritans were?
Mm-hmm.
But now we're in that pendulum
It's not so much even maybe they don't have so many options because they're dominated by foreign army this time. So they're not the military power. It's not all about their army and their king anymore. So it better be about their God.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they're not a people.
But and that's an attitude that originated not in Jerusalem but in Babylon, when all they had was the law. They had Ezekiel preaching to them. They had Daniel preaching to them about the law and about, you guys are here because you disobeyed God. The origins of the synagogue are believed to be in this period of exile. The synagogue has no sacrifices. The synagogue just reads the law. So the idea, that's all we've got, now becomes even more impressed. You were able to take Judaism beyond the borders of Jerusalem. By the time of Ezra, there's three major communities in the Jewish world. There's the community in Jerusalem, which observes the temple worship. There's the community in Babylon, and there's the community in Egypt. Because some of the Jews from Jerusalem, after its fall, went to Egypt and started a group. So,
Yeah, we got to go get a kid.
ready to go get a kid?
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry.
Well, thanks for coming. We're about done. So let's end with Nehemiah. One last section, and we'll finish up the book of Esther. No book in the Old Testament is more hotly debated than the book of Esther. Exactly. And it doesn't help that Esther was nowhere found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, it could just be an accident. That happened to be one book that wasn't discovered. Even though all of the other books have been found in one portion or another, some portions are just, a couple verses. Who's to say that Esther did exist, but for some reason she didn't
It's a good story. Let's not leave it out.
So, it also doesn't help that Esther, because of the lack of God, is argued even among Protestants. Why are we keeping this in the Bible? There's nothing about God in here. Matter of fact, the main characters, Esther, Mordecai, are both guilty of sin. Esther, for example, it was part of Ezra's mandate to put away foreign wives because they were foreign. Esther, being a Jewess, went into a foreign king's bed, and whatever happens, what happens. She is not pure by any means. Mordecai, the whole thing that happens with him is that he gets puffed up, and he doesn't bow the knee to Haman. So, Haman doesn't like that. I don't know if these are the first two sections. Section 1 is the beauty pageant, chapters 1 through 2:18, which then makes our second section, Mordecai's pride, 2:19 to 3:6, which sets, of course, the rest of the book in motion. The third section is Haman's cruel plot and result. Because of Mordecai's insolent behavior, Haman gets upset. And because of this one Jew, Haman decides all Jews should die. It had to be something pretty big for Haman to feel that way about all the Jews just because of the one guy. Anyway, the last section, of course, is the Jews rejoice, 9:16 to 10:3. This is the institution of the Feast of Purim, where they celebrate and they have a good time. It has been suggested the book of Esther was composed as late as 200 BC, which puts it really close to more modern biblical times. Some say it's as early as 525 BC, which puts it like next generation after she lived. I don't know. This is a tough one. Esther is so refined. I mean, when I preached this, it was last summer, book of Esther. The book just goes. It is so well structured. It is a powerful story, and it does infringe. It does begin to breach the limits of, well, did this really happen, or is this just a story? I'm going to leave on the side this really happened. Because yes, it is a good story. A lot of the stories in the Bible are really good stories. Esther, one point that lends credibility to her is the Septuagint. The Septuagint, which we believe is right around this time, 200 BC, was done, knew that Esther lacked this whole idea of God. So, in the Septuagint, there are additions to the book of Esther. There are prayers. There's material that is very religious in nature, as if to say, we know this didn't make it the original draft. We're going to make sure it makes it in this time, so that without a doubt we know that Esther. At 200 BC, Esther was recognized as a book that needed some work. So it had to have existed before 200 BC. The argument about whether Esther should be in there or not had to have existed before 200 BC. I'm leaning probably 525 to 450 again, as that moment when right around the time that Ezra and Nehemiah are done. I have a hard time believing that Ezra or Nehemiah are one of those guys who wrote Esther. Simply because the themes of Esther clash with the themes that are in Ezra. Ezra has this whole idea of being pure, of being law-abiding, of being holy, whereas Esther has none of that. It is a story that reinforces that God is in control, without even mentioning his name. But the themes of Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah just aren't there. So it's probably somebody else. It may have been Esther herself. It may have been Mordecai. Some have said that Mordecai is actually the author. Put this thing together. Others have said it was somebody else, somebody much later that simply went back through and found records. I'm going to lean personally to Mordecai. Just as a, for lack of, there's no really other good candidates out there. Mordecai seems to be a good representative of that. But that really finishes up this whole section of history. Any questions about tonight? Before we close up? No? Excellent. I've explained everything to excess tonight. Okay, that means that next week, next section is going to be poetry. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, wisdom, poetry. Yeah.
Oh, is it included in that one?
Wisdom and poetry.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say there. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Son of Solomon. 5 big books. So I'm looking forward to that. I tell you, when I having gone through this, I was pleasantly surprised by just pulling out mostly by who in the human hands involved. That was very good, very interesting to see that. Okay, let's close with prayer, and we'll call it a night. Father in heaven, I just want to thank you for your presence tonight. Pray that you got us safely home, that we'll be restored to our families. Father, help us to get good rest tonight, so we'll be ready to go out again tomorrow. I want to pray these things in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, who we owe this book, this glorious and wonderful book.